Voice of Geekdom is now on Patreon. Please check out the link in the description to find out how you could gain access to premium content and social features. Hello Tolkien geeks! Today's video is the long-promised final part of my series on Tolkien's wizards. We'll be dealing with a few unanswered questions in today's video. You don't have to have watched the first two videos to understand or appreciate this one. Nonetheless, those were some of my favourite videos that I've created to date, and you'll find links to those down in the description. I've decided to start with one of the really big questions, which is the title to this video, which is one of the questions asked most often about the story, and which is often pointed to as a potential plot hole. Gandalf takes 17 years between Bilbo's disturbing actions at his party and his returning to explain the history of the ring to Frodo. Why is he gone so long? And why doesn't he figure all of this out much earlier? I touched on this a little in the previous video on the wizards, which focused on their history up until the War of the Ring. And there, we charted Saruman's corruption and the actions he takes in order to conceal his intentions and further his plans. When Saruman informs the Council that the One Ring had rolled down the river into the sea, this is accepted as fact. Gandalf and the others have no reason to question Saruman's findings, and so recognise his ruling on the matter as the de facto expert in ring lore. This was also before Saruman had used the Palantir of Orthanc, according to the Tale of Years in Appendix B to The Lord of the Rings. Saruman's betrayal wasn't yet complete. In Chapter 2 of The Lord of the Rings, The Shadow of the Past, Gandalf gives Frodo and the reader an overview of the history of the rings. The three, fairest of all, the elf lords hid from him, and his hand never touched them or sullied them. 7 the dwarf kings possessed, but 3 he has recovered, and the others the dragons have consumed. 9 he gave to mortal men, proud and great, and so ensnared them. Long ago they fell under the dominion of the One, and they became ring-wraiths, shadows under his great shadow, his most terrible servants. In addition to the 19 Great Rings, Gandalf tells us that there were an unknown number of lesser rings in existence, which were all manufactured in Eregion during the same period. But he also acknowledges that he always suspected that Bilbo's ring was one of the Great Rings, since only the Great Rings had the power to confer long life. So if the rings were all accounted for, and Bilbo's ring wasn't one of the lesser rings, then why wouldn't Gandalf use the process of elimination to reach the conclusion that Bilbo's ring was the one? Consider that, logically, the One Ring was just as much accounted for as many of the others, perhaps more so than some of them, assuming that we take Saruman at his word. When Gandalf tells us of the fates of the rings, he is simply repeating the conventional wisdom on the matter. For many years, the generally accepted answer was that Sauron's Master Ring was lost forever. Then consider what we know of the other Great Rings, based upon what Gandalf says in Chapter 2 here, and what we can piece together of the information that this is based upon. Gandalf knows for a fact that Thror's ring, the ring of Durin's folk, was lost when Sauron took it from Thrain, Thorin's father. Gandalf discovered this information firsthand in the dungeons of Dol Guldur. But what of the others? How much confidence can he reasonably have in their whereabouts? Does he know where they all are for a fact? Were there eyewitnesses to the dragons consuming 4 of the dwarven rings, for instance? That seems unlikely. And what of the 9? Once the ring-wraiths were enslaved, Sauron keeps them with him. The Nazgul no longer wear their rings. In all the long years that Sauron was unable to take physical shape, could the 9 have been misplaced or stolen? Is that more or less likely than the One Ring being found in the way that it was? Also, consider that the ring was found by Bilbo deep under the Misty Mountains in Gollum's cave. Why should the one have turned up there when it was last seen at the Gladden Fields? Is that truly the most logical conclusion? There are other possibilities at this point, and the One Ring is not the explanation that best fits the facts until after Gandalf has all of the information. Once Gandalf begins to suspect that Bilbo's ring was actively harming him, the wizard begins to conduct an investigation, one which isn't concluded for 17 years. One of the main reasons that this process takes so long is the distances that he covers in order to track Gollum. And once he captures Gollum, with the aid of Aragorn, only then is he able to account for the ring's journey to the underground cave under the mountains. It should also be stated that it is also true that Saruman tells the White Council in 2953 that the Rings of Power each had their proper gem, while the One Ring was round and unadorned. This clue, when Gandalf finally remembers it years later, is what drives him to seek answers in the records of Isildur's recovery of the ring in Minas Tirith. But this last meeting of the White Council was 50 years before Bilbo's party, when Gandalf begins to seriously suspect that Bilbo's ring is the one, and only 12 years after Bilbo found the ring in Gollum's cave during The Hobbit. Too soon for Bilbo to show signs of forestalling the aging process, and thus too soon for Gandalf to conclude that Bilbo's ring was one of the Great Rings. This isn't a plot hole. Should Gandalf regret not seeking answers about the ring sooner? Should he regret trusting Saruman's advice and assertions? The answers are yes and yes, and I believe that Gandalf does have regrets. He says as much during the Council of Elrond. But is Gandalf inordinately naive for not realizing his mistakes sooner? I don't think so, and the timeline of events backs this up. The next question concerns Saruman, and we begin with a quote from Gandalf. "Late one evening I came to the gate, like a great arch in the wall of rock, and it was strongly guarded. But the keepers of the gate were on the watch for me, and told me that Saruman awaited me. I rode under the arch, and the gate closed silently behind me, and suddenly I was afraid, though I knew no reason for it. But I rode to the foot of Orthanc, and came to the stair of Saruman, and there he met me and led me up to his high chamber. He wore a ring on his finger." When Gandalf is recounting his visit to Isengard during the Council of Elrond, he mentions that he noticed a ring on Saruman's finger when he first meets him. Later, when the two of them begin to quarrel over Saruman's desire to rule over the world of men, Saruman refers to himself as Saruman the Wise, Saruman Ringmaker, Saruman of many colours. Evidently, we are meant to think that Saruman attempted the manufacture of his own Ring of Power. But how successful was he, and what did he use it for? My assumption is that Saruman studied whatever remained of the knowledge of Celebrimbor and the smiths of Eregion, the teachings of Sauron which the Rings of Power were forged with. In Chapter 2, when Saruman is first mentioned, Gandalf tells us that the lore of the Elven Rings, great and small, is his province. He has long studied it, seeking the lost secrets of their making, and presumably he tried to replicate it. Perhaps he even began this endeavour with the best of intentions. As Elrond said at the council, shortly after Gandalf finishes telling the tale of Saruman's treachery, "It is perilous to study too deeply the arts of the enemy, for good or for ill." Creating a new Ring of Power is self-evidently a very bad idea. There is quite a bit of evidence to suggest that the creation of the Rings of Power in the Second Age, in and of itself, was a misstep on the part of the elves, and to create a new ring, millennia later, after Sauron's treachery is known, is actively foolish. In practical terms, not only could this have the potential to render Saruman vulnerable to Sauron's ring, but the Lord of the Rings leads us to believe that, in the case of the One Ring, Sauron put much of his own power and essence into his device, thus weakening himself when he is without it. We don't know enough about Saruman's ring to know for sure that this same transferal of power took place, but it seems plausible, perhaps even likely, and fits with the theme of Saruman following the same path as Sauron. Perhaps if Saruman's ring did indeed lessen his own power, this could be, at least in part, an explanation for the ease with which Gandalf was able to break Saruman's staff when he confronts him at Isengard after his army was defeated at Helm's Deep. Saruman seems to be quite proud of his creation and deems it worthy of boastfulness, which tells us that the process probably was effective, at least in his own eyes. Generally speaking, a bearer of a ring of power enhances his or her own innate power when wearing it. As Galadriel said to Frodo, "The rings give power according to the measure of each possessor." One of Saruman's chief powers is his gift for persuasion. Much is made of the power of his voice in The Lord of the Rings, and so I rather like the idea that his Ring of Power may have aided him in the task of turning his enemies against one another, perhaps helping to sway the Dunlendings into his service in the war against Rohan, or enabling him to so effectively influence Theoden from afar, using Wormtongue as his mouthpiece. Sadly, Tolkien doesn't tell us this, and this minor plot point isn't developed further. But it's fun to speculate. The final question I have to address is on Radagast. What is his eventual fate? After his cameo in Gandalf's story to the Council of Elrond, in which he is duped by Saruman into luring Gandalf into a trap, we never hear about him again. It is speculated in the essay on the Istari that we get in Unfinished Tales that Radagast failed in his mission due to his preoccupation with nature and due to his general apathy towards the war with Sauron, which was supposed to be his purpose. But this seems to be just speculation. If we take this at face value, however, it seems less likely that Radagast ever returned to Valinor aboard one of the elven ships. Radagast's home at Ross Goble was said to have been found abandoned when scouts from Rivendell crossed the Misty Mountains prior to the departure of the Ringbearer. Perhaps he found somewhere to hide and ride out the war far away from the action. We don't really know if a wizard's body can die of natural causes. We know that they can be slain, but we can't say for sure whether they're subject to death from old age. The Istari were apparently subject to a very, very slow aging process, and so my guess is that, over time, Radagast faded and became a disembodied spirit of nature. When Saruman dies after being attacked by his slave Grima Wormtongue at Bag End, we see his spirit take visible form as it leaves his body. To the dismay of those that stood by, about the body of Saruman a grey mist gathered, rising slowly to a great height, like smoke from a fire. As a pale, shrouded figure it loomed over the hill. For a moment it wavered, looking to the west, but out of the west came a cold wind, and it bent away, and with a sigh dissolved into nothing. This cold wind is likely Manwë denying Saruman entry into the west. Silmarillion readers will recognise this sign instantly. When Radagast dies, would the Valar deny him in this way? I'm not so sure. Maybe, in the end, Radagast was given leave to return in his disembodied form, in exactly the way that Saruman tried to, and then he was restored to his original state as a Maya of Yavanna. He is guilty of inaction, and perhaps of cowardice, but Radagast is no traitor.
And my axe.
Thank you to my Axe tier Patreon supporters. Erin M, Stephen Stark the Maya from Here Be Dragons, Kelly the Jaded Shipwright, Alexander Petrov, Joshua Boniface, and our newest axe wielder, A.N. Kreutzberg.